There's a photograph taken in Port Arthur, Texas, sometime around 1958. A teenage girl sits alone at the edge of a school gymnasium during a dance. Everyone else is paired off, moving beneath paper streamers and borrowed light. She is not. She sits with her hands folded in her lap, watching the room with eyes that seem to be calculating something the rest of the room doesn't understand yet. She is not crying. She is not visibly angry. She simply looks like someone who already knows she does not belong here and hasn't yet decided whether that is a tragedy or a gift. Her name is Janis Joplin. She is 14 years old, and she will spend the next 12 years of her life trying to answer the question that photograph quietly asks: what do you do with a spirit too large for the place that made you? Millions of people would eventually feel the answer in their chests, in concert halls and on scratchy vinyl records, in the raw, impossible power of a voice that sounded like it was being pulled from somewhere deeper than technique could reach. But before all of that, before the sold out stages and the magazine covers and the voice that made grown men weep and strangers reach for each other's hands, there was just a girl in Port Arthur who didn't fit. And what was done to her there, in that small and certain town, would shape everything that came after. Every note, every scream, every moment of transcendence that audiences mistook for effortlessness. The real story of Janis Joplin does not begin on a stage. It begins in a place that tried very hard to make sure she would never find one. But what that place could not understand, what nobody around her understood yet, was that the very things they used to diminish her would become the fuel for something no one in Port Arthur could have predicted, and that is where this story begins. Port Arthur, Texas was not an unkind place in the conventional sense. It was simply a place with an extremely clear idea of what a person should be and an extremely limited tolerance for anything that fell outside that idea. In the 1950s, the town sat on the Gulf Coast of southeast Texas, its economy built around oil refineries and shipping, its culture built around the certainties of post-war American life. People worked hard, they went to church, they raised children who were expected to behave in recognizable ways, want recognizable things, and become recognizable versions of their parents. Seth and Dorothy Joplin were reasonable, educated people. Seth worked as an engineer for Texaco. Dorothy had attended college, which was unusual for women of her generation and place. They read books, they encouraged their children to think. By the standards of Port Arthur in 1950, the Joplin household was considered progressive, even intellectual. And yet, even in that household, there were limits. There were shapes a person was supposed to fit. And their eldest daughter, born January 1943, seemed constitutionally incapable of fitting any of them. From the earliest age, Janis Joplin was too much, too loud, too restless, too curious, too willing to say the thing other people left carefully unsaid. She had friends in elementary school, was reasonably social, showed an early love of art and drawing that her parents gently encouraged. But something shifted as she moved into adolescence. The world began demanding that she become smaller, quieter, more contained, and Janis was physically incapable of complying. Not out of rebellion, not initially, simply because the shape they were asking her to take was not a shape she was made for. She discovered music the way some people discover a language they already somehow knew, not as something to be learned, but as something to be recognized. Blues records, folk records, Bessie Smith and Lead Belly, and the raw, howling bottom end of American musical tradition. She heard in that music something she had not yet been able to say out loud, that pain was real, that it deserved to be expressed, and that expressing it beautifully was not weakness but power. She didn't just listen to those records, she absorbed them, let them rearrange something inside her, returned to them the way other people return to mirrors. But the world of Port Arthur High School had no category for a girl who spent her evenings listening to Bessie Smith and painting abstract expressionist canvases and reading Jack Kerouac. What Port Arthur High School had was a very efficient system for identifying people who didn't fit and making sure they understood exactly how badly they didn't fit. The bullying began in earnest around ninth grade. It was not the dramatic, cinematic kind. It was the quieter, more corrosive kind. Exclusion, mockery, the slow accumulation of small cruelties that, taken individually, seemed minor, but that together formed something suffocating. Boys made comments about her appearance. Girls excluded her from social groups with the practiced efficiency that teenage girls have always deployed against those they find threatening or strange. She was called ugly. She was called weird. She was called names that were designed to make her feel that the very qualities that made her different were flaws requiring correction. And then in 1960, the cruelty found its most precise form. The students of Thomas Jefferson High School were voting on various superlatives for the school paper. Someone nominated Janis Joplin for Ugliest Man on campus. Not Ugliest Girl, Ugliest Man. The nomination was not just about appearance, it was a statement about her refusal to conform to femininity as Port Arthur defined it. The vote went through. The result was published. Janice was 17 years old. She went home that day and told nobody what had happened. Not her parents, not the few friends she had. She put the information somewhere deep inside herself, in the same place where all the other accumulated humiliations had been stored. And then, because there was nothing else to do, she kept going. What happened in those years, the specific texture of that pain, the particular weight of being made to feel wrong in the place that was supposed to make you feel safe, would take another decade to fully surface. It would surface not in therapy or in private conversation, but in public, on stages through a voice that had learned to transform private anguish into shared catharsis. But that was still far in the future. For now, Janis Joplin was simply a girl from Port Arthur who had decided, quietly and with great certainty, that she was not going to stay. The question of when exactly a person decides to leave is rarely as clean as the stories we tell about it afterward. There is rarely one morning of clarity, one conversation that changes everything. More often, there is a slow accumulation of knowing, a gradual internal pressure that builds until staying becomes more impossible than going. For Janis Joplin, the decision to leave Port Arthur was less a single choice than a series of incremental escapes, each one going a little further than the last. She enrolled at Lamar State College of Technology in Beaumont in 1961, close enough to home to satisfy her parents, but far enough to feel like movement. She played guitar in coffee shops. She sang at small venues, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as she discovered something that would define the next decade of her life, that the stage was the one place where the things that made her strange in Port Arthur made her extraordinary. Because that voice, that instrument she'd been quietly developing through years of listening and absorbing and privately practicing, was unlike anything the small Texas music scene had heard from someone her age. It wasn't polished. It wasn't controlled in the ways that conventional vocal training valued. It was something rawer and more immediate than that. It sounded like honesty made audible, like someone who had learned that the only defense against a world determined to diminish you was to be undeniably, unmistakably real. She hitchhiked to Austin. She discovered the folk scene there, found other people who existed outside the mainstream, who read strange books and listened to strange records, and stayed up too late talking about things that mattered. For the first time in her life, the qualities that had made her a target in Port Arthur made her interesting. She was surrounded by people who responded to her difference with curiosity rather than contempt. It did not solve the deeper wound, nothing that simple ever could, but it gave her enough oxygen to keep moving. And then in 1963, she heard about San Francisco. The name itself had begun to carry a particular weight in certain American subcultures. Beat poets and folk musicians and people who had opted out of conventional life were gravitating toward it, drawn by a combination of geography and mythology. Janice had a friend who'd been there who described North Beach coffee houses and cheap apartments, and a whole ecosystem of people who were building something new out of the wreckage of what they'd rejected. She packed what she owned, arranged a ride, and headed west with the particular urgency of someone who has been waiting their entire life for a specific destination without knowing its name until now. San Francisco in 1963 was not yet the epicenter of the counterculture it would become, but it was already something, already a place where a girl from Port Arthur could walk into a bar and sing Bessie Smith songs and be received not as an aberration, but as a revelation. She was 20 years old. She was broke, living in cheap rooms, eating irregularly, wearing clothes she found or borrowed. None of that mattered as much as the fact that for the first time in her life, the city she was in seemed to have been built to some extent for people like her. She sang wherever she could. Folk clubs, coffee houses, bars where the audience was more interested in conversation than performance. She developed her voice in public, which is the only real way to develop a voice, learning through immediate response what worked and what didn't, discovering the particular quality of attention she could generate when she stopped trying to sound like anything she'd heard before and simply sang the way her body wanted to sing, loud, raw, emotionally unguarded in ways that made audiences feel implicated in something private. But this first period in San Francisco did not hold. She returned to Port Arthur in 1965, thinner and quieter, carrying things she didn't speak about openly. She enrolled briefly at the University of Texas at Austin. She made a genuine effort to become the version of herself her parents hoped she might still become. It lasted less than a year. In the summer of 1966, a musician named Travis Rivers made a phone call that would change the trajectory of American rock music, though neither he nor the person he was calling could have known that at the time. Travis had seen Janis perform years earlier and had never forgotten the particular quality of what she did on stage. He was now connected to a San Francisco band called Big Brother and the Holding Company, a psychedelic rock group looking for a lead vocalist. He suggested Janis. She arrived in San Francisco in June of 1966 and walked into rehearsal with Big Brother and the Holding Company on a Thursday afternoon. What happened in that rehearsal room is the kind of event that people who were present still struggle to describe accurately. It was not simply that she was good, it was that the combination of her voice with the band's sound created something that seemed to exceed what either element could produce independently. The band played louder and with more freedom because she was pushing them. She sang with more abandon because they were giving her something to launch from. Dave Getz, the band's drummer, would later say that he knew within the first song that something fundamental had changed, that the room itself felt different, the air felt different, the sense of what was possible felt different. That is what a genuinely transformative voice does to a space. It doesn't just fill it, it reorganizes it. Janis moved into the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood with the rest of the band. She dressed with the extravagance that had been forbidden in Texas. She spoke her mind without apology. She loved openly and impulsively. And she sang, night after night in small clubs and outdoor venues, and eventually on stages that grew larger as the band's reputation spread. She sang with a totality of commitment that audiences found genuinely overwhelming. When Janis Joplin stood at a microphone, the distance between the performer and the emotion being expressed collapsed entirely. She did not sing about longing. She longed audibly in real time in front of strangers who found themselves longing with her before they fully understood what was happening. She performed at the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 1967, and what happened there propelled Janis from local phenomenon to national conversation almost overnight. She sang Ball and Chain with an intensity that silenced the crowd in a way that crowds at rock festivals are not usually silenced. When she finished, there was a pause genuinely longer than the usual gap between a song ending and applause beginning, and then the crowd erupted in a way that witnesses still describe as unlike anything they had experienced before. Within weeks, Janis Joplin was no longer a San Francisco secret, but what the cameras captured was the performance. What the cameras could not capture was what it cost her to give it. There is a particular misunderstanding that follows performers who give everything on stage, the assumption that because the emotion is real, the giving of it must be easy. The emotional openness that made her extraordinary on stage was not something she could put on and take off. It was the baseline condition of her experience. She felt things with an intensity that was not modulated by the social structures that protect most people from the full force of their own emotional lives. The things that had happened in Port Arthur had not disappeared because San Francisco embraced her. They had gone quieter, but they had not gone away. Success muffled them but did not resolve them. The hunger for belonging that had made her desperate in Texas reappeared in California in different forms, in the urgency with which she attached to people, in the way she needed rooms to love her in the immediate physical way that Port Arthur never had. She signed with Columbia Records in 1968, released Cheap Thrills, which went to #1 on the Billboard charts and stayed there for 8 weeks. She became an icon as she was discovering, live inside a particular kind of loneliness. The stage gave her everything she had been denied in Texas, but the stage was also temporary. Every concert ended. Every crowd dispersed. The hotel room that followed was always the same hotel room, quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet, empty in a way that had a particular weight. She spoke about this in interviews. She kept turning from music into something deeper. She talked about the loneliness of performing, the paradox of giving everything to a room full of people and walking off stage feeling more alone than before. She talked about wanting to be loved, not as a performance or a symbol, but as a person. The specific ordinary intimacy of someone knowing your habits and tolerating your moods and choosing to stay anyway. These were not complaints. She understood that what she had was extraordinary, but understanding the extraordinary nature of something does not protect you from the weight of what it costs. And what gave that voice its power, what made it sound like truth rather than performance, was precisely the fact that the cost was real. In November of 1969, Janis Joplin returned to Port Arthur, Texas. She had been invited back to be honored at a reunion connected to Thomas Jefferson High School, the same school where 9 years earlier she had been voted ugliest man on campus. The town that had made her feel monstrous now wanted to claim her as its own. She arrived wearing everything that Port Arthur had tried to tell her she had no right to wear: full color, full feathers, full presence, the beaded necklaces and the wild hair, and the complete, unapologetic declaration of self that had been forming for years in deliberate opposition to everything this place had once demanded she become. A journalist asked her whether it felt strange to be returning to a place that had treated her so badly. She paused for a moment, then she said quietly, "I wanted to show them. I wanted them to see what they passed up." There was no bitterness in her voice when she said it. Something else, not triumph, exactly, though triumph was part of it. The specific ache of needing to prove something to people who may not even remember the original wound. The particular sadness of realizing that vindication, when it finally arrives, cannot actually undo what it was meant to undo. She attended the reunion. She was gracious. She performed the graciousness that fame requires in situations like this one. And then she went back to the hotel and sat in the same kind of quiet that always followed the stage. But something had been completed in that visit. She had gone back. She had walked into the place that had tried to define her, and she had stood in it as herself, fully, without apology. That was worth something. It was not everything, but it was worth something. The last year of her life saw her at the height of her powers. She was recording what would become Pearl, her most polished and emotionally complete album, working with producer Paul Rothchild, collaborating with a new band called the Full Tilt Boogie Band. The sessions at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles were by every account extraordinary, a performer in full command of an instrument she had spent a decade developing, bringing a lifetime of accumulated emotion to material that could sustain the weight of it. She was 27 years old. She was focused with a discipline that surprised people who had built their image of her around the wildness. She was, by every account, happy in the particular way that artists are happy when they are making something they know is good. On October 1st, 1970, she recorded the vocal for Me and Bobby McGee. She sang it with a freedom that sounded effortless and was the product of everything she had ever experienced: the hitchhiked miles, the cold rooms, the long way from Port Arthur to everywhere she had ever managed to reach. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. She had lived the sentence before she sang it, and the singing had the quality of something that has been earned. 4 days later, on October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin died in her room at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood. She was 27 years old. Pearl was released posthumously in January 19. Today, Port Arthur has a museum dedicated in part to Janis Joplin. Tour groups visit. The information panels describe her early years with a warmth and appreciation that was not available to her when she was actually living them. This is the particular irony that fame delivers to those who were exiled before they were celebrated. The place that rejected you eventually builds a monument to your memory, and the pride is genuine, and none of that can change what the rejection felt like when it was happening. Both things are true simultaneously. What Janis Joplin left behind is not reducible to an album catalog or a set of concert recordings, though those are extraordinary. What she left behind is a demonstration, visceral, permanent, repeated every time someone puts on one of her records, that the qualities which make a person unacceptable to small certain places can be precisely the qualities that make them indispensable to the larger world. She never fully resolved the distance between who she was and who Port Arthur had told her she should be. She never quite stopped needing the room to love her back. She never fully silenced the girl who had sat alone at that gymnasium dance, wondering whether there was a place in the world for someone shaped the way she was. But she also never stopped asking. And in the asking, in the raw, unguarded, terrifyingly honest asking that she did with her voice every time she stepped to a microphone, she gave everyone who had ever felt too much, been too loud, been voted wrong by the people around them, something that no superlative can provide. She gave them proof that the excess was the gift. Janis Joplin went back to Port Arthur in 1969 and showed them what they had passed up. But the truer legacy is this: she showed the rest of the world what it would have missed too if she had listened. And the voice she refused to quiet is still, half a century later, louder than the silence they tried to hand her. That is not a small thing. In the history of American music, in the history of anyone who has ever felt wrong in the place that made them, that is everything.